Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar called The Business Risk of Unverified Skills Data. During this presentation, please feel free to ask questions within the chat box, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. My name is Anthony Campagnano, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Talent Guard. Before we get started, I'd like to share with you a little bit about Talent Guard. Talent Guard offers a unified talent management suite of SaaS modules to help companies understand, develop, and prepare their workforce for the future. Those offerings are here on this slide. With that said, I'm now excited to introduce today's guest and presenter. Joining us today is Ben Eubanks, the Principal Analyst of Lighthouse Research and Advisory. Ben, please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tony. Hey, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Looking forward to a good discussion today, sharing some ideas with you, some concepts, and hopefully having a little bit of a dialogue. Got a couple places inserted specifically in this conversation, so you can chime in the chat as we're going. So as I pause to ask some questions as we go through here, please feel free to chime in. I have seen in a lot of events lately that we all want to be a little more participative and less spectators. So hopefully you can join in and share your thoughts, and we can learn from each other too. So obviously you can ask questions as well, like Tony said, but just want to make sure we're going to have some social opportunities as we're going through this with the chat. So I spent more than 10 years of my life dedicated to the practice of HR and talent. Before I was a researcher, as I am now, I was a practitioner in the trenches. And so today, as we're talking through this topic and everything else, I'll probably bring in some of those stories as examples, those practical applications as we go. But one of the first things that comes to mind, just to set the stage a little bit before we dive in, is the last HR job that I had before I became a researcher. I worked for a government contractor. And if you've never worked in that space, one of the things that you have to do as a company is respond to these requests for proposal from the government, where they're looking for services or looking for support, and you have to respond to those needs. And being the head of HR, it was my job to understand the skills that our organization had so we could match those up and respond whenever one of those RFPs came out. And so that's the first opportunity for me to dip my toe in this space all those years ago. And now coming out from the research side, I love being able to see how companies are solving this problem. And we'll share some stories and case studies in a little while to help you figure out how other companies are doing that, so you can learn some of the lessons from them. But one of the challenges that we had with that process of going through those things is we had things like employee resumes, and that was about it. I didn't have a lot of other data on hand. And that was a challenge because I couldn't, if someone had this new and important skill, we didn't have a way to capture that and share that when we were trying to put these together. And so I'm sure looking back now, in some of those cases, it actually cost us in terms of business and opportunities and things we could have won because we didn't have that data. And again, that's just a quick little anecdote to set the stage for you, but we'll go through today and I'll share with you some of the things that we're doing, the most common ways companies are actually looking at the skills of their people and why those might not be the best way, how we can get better at that. So you've been looking at my face here for a few minutes, but I'll give you the quick version of what I do. My first and best job is as a husband and a father to 4 kids, 10 and under. That is keeping us busy. If you have been getting into virtual school or thinking about that and you're a little stressed, I'm right there with you. We're fighting that battle right now as well. So thumbs up to you. Hats off if you're also working through that. I know it's a challenge and we're gonna make it. Don't you worry, we're gonna make it through this. So my day job, I actually I run Lighthouse Research and Advisory. We do 2 kinds of research there. On one side, we look at the technology that companies use to support their HR operations, their talent operations. And so we talk to 300 plus vendors a year to figure out what they're doing, how they're solving problems, who they're serving, and we share that research freely with practitioners that want to understand more about that. The other side, though, which is a ton of fun for me, I tell everyone I'm professionally curious, that there's a lot of questions I want to know answers to. We actually do research on the trends and practices side to figure out what's happening in the space, what the best and highest performing companies are doing, and things we can learn from them in terms of lessons. And I'll try to sprinkle in some of those today if I have a chance that weave into the conversation. When I'm not doing that, I'm an author, I'm a podcast host, I do a lot of different things, and you can see there at the bottom some of the different companies that have used our research, that participate in our research, that have found value in that. So just a quick heads up on the kinds of things that I do, the background that I bring to the table, As I said, I was a practitioner before this, and now on the research side. So it's a ton of fun to be able to blend those two perspectives. I mentioned research, so I'm going to keep talking about that. Data is one of the things that I believe we can use to make a bigger business impact. I'm a firm believer in evidence-based HR, using evidence to support the things we should be doing. And one of the reports we did with the team at Talent Guard, yeah, it was either early this year or into last year, sometime fairly recently, we did this report with them around skills gaps, upskilling, reskilling, pulled in some of our research. And so a little bit of what we talk about today is actually in there, but we also have some stories and examples as well, some that are not covered in the conversation. So if you want to check that out, we'll make sure the link there, get that out in the slides for you if you want to check that out so you can learn more about some of the writing. If you enjoy the style today, you enjoy the content, I write just like I speak. I want it to be very practical and plain language. We don't need any, we don't need big words and things like that to try to convey these things, because we need to speak the language of the business. For our agenda, we're going to cover three big buckets in the conversation. We're going to start with research. We're going to talk about some of the data we have there. We're going to share with you what's happening in that space. I'm going to really try to get you firmly rooted in this idea that we should be understanding, measuring, and validating, verifying the skills that we have in the business. We're going to talk about some stories. I'll give you some case studies. Companies are doing a good job there that we can all learn from. A company that's struggling a little bit there, we can learn from that as well. And then I'm going to finish up with some action items, try to make this very practical and actionable for you. So as we're going through, you're like, oh, this is interesting. I like that idea. This is a good snippet, a good research point. As you're pulling those things together and seeing those things that hit you through the conversation, that last section will be all about how to put those into action and think about what to do next. I don't want you to walk away from this conversation just inspired or just excited about this, although that's good. I want you to walk away with some ideas on how to actually make this more rigorous, take a more rigorous approach in your own company. So let's go ahead and dive into this. I've said it a couple of times, I'm a researcher by trade. So I'm pulling together different studies, data, things like that to help make the case that skills are and should be a priority. And I'm also going to share some of the gaps in how they're currently actually identified for companies. So take a look at this. This chart here is actually displaying a concept of organizational value. And I'll go ahead and tell you what it is. My piece didn't here. Okay, so I'll tell you what it is because my slide did not build the way it was supposed to. So what we see here, the blue on this chart actually represents intangible assets for employers, for the S&P 500, so the 500 companies that make up the bulk of the United States economy. The blue here indicates the value of their intangible assets, the things that there's not a physical plant or property or device, technology, anything you can put your hands on. That's kind of the lightly shaded version. So the dark blue is all those things that are ideas, that are concepts, that are skills, things that we don't have a physical thing we can look at and say that's what that is. And I've shared this with you to help illustrate this idea that over time, this focus on skills has become more and more and more important. This data is even here as a couple of years old. I'm really curious to see what the next one looks like, because I would imagine this is going to continue that trend. Right? We'll never have a fully 100% because we're still going to have physical buildings and places for people to work, things like that. But we've seen this incredible shift, and in the last, 40 years, it's done a complete reversal from 83% being tangible to 84% being intangible. So big focus there is so much organizational value tied up in the skills and the intangible things, the ideas, the intellectual property inside the business. And that's why this demands some level of rigor when we look at how to understand this, how to measure this, how to track those skills on an ongoing basis. If you, right now in your company, I know every company's not the same, but if you needed to go and buy a new office chair, you'd have several sign-offs to get approval for that. You'd have to, make your justification, things like that. But we don't have that same level of focus around verifying someone's skills. If I just say I have a skill in general, people just believe that. Or if a manager says that this person has a skill, we just believe that and move on. We don't stop to put that same level of rigor around it. And that we're talking about an office chair, right, in this example. So there's so much opportunity there for us to get better about looking at that. So this is one of the chances I'm going to give you. You're here, you're hanging out with us. I would love to hear from you because this is part of the conversation overall. We're going to touch on this some more as we go, but just to help me understand where we are from an audience perspective, if I had to press you right now, what percent of the workforce inside the business do you have some sort of skill data on? Is it 10% of your people, 1 out of 10? Is it 90%? We're really, really deep there. Pop something in the chat so I can see that, but I'm just kind of curious what your number might be. I've seen it all over the map. And again, there's not a right or wrong answer here. I'm just kind of curious to see where everybody might be. So as I said, we're going to talk about this in a little bit. There's a company I'm going to give you a case study of that has about they admitted to me they have about a 10% clarity on the skills of the people inside their business. They're missing out on 90% of those. And again, some of the stories that I have, some of the examples of companies I talk to and the work we do, sometimes that's really low, sometimes it's really high. So we're going to talk about some of those components of this as we go through the discussion. Really quickly, before we go any farther into skills measurement, I want to remind you how skills are actually acquired, because we sometimes skip over that piece. So if you're not in the learning space, if you're more in HR, you might not have heard of the 70-20-10 model in the past. But one of the things that drives how we learn as adults, not just in the workplace, but as human beings in general, we learn through 3 different types of learning. Number 1, on the job, or I'll call that experiential, because it's hands-on. I'm trying, I'm failing, I'm learning this as I go. I mess it up the first time, but I get it right the second time. That is experiential learning. And a full 70% of how we learn as adults comes from that. So the bulk of it comes from us trying things and failing it. Just like one of my kids learns, hey, that stove is hot, don't touch that. Thankfully, we haven't had that lesson, but one of them cut their finger this morning during school on one of the pencil sharpeners, not realizing it was sharp. So experiential, lesson learned, they understand that. 20% of how we learn as adults comes from learning through others. Social, mentoring, just kind of interacting with other people and picking up lessons and ideas from them. 20% comes from that. And then 10% comes from formal learning. But what's interesting is if I did not give you these numbers and I had asked you outright, how much of the learning that you know as an adult came from formal education and training, you might have given that a heavier weight. But what they found is that is a good root, a foundation, a stepping stone. But in general, that just sets the foundation. And the rest of these kinds of learning, these informal learning methods, learning from others socially, learning experientially, those add around that to really build out how we learn as people, as adults, as humans. I'll give you one last data point on this before I move on. So Gallup did a study a couple of years ago, and they actually asked chief academic officers at educational institutions, hey, for these graduates that are coming out, for these graduates that are stepping out into the workforce, they've got their degree, they got their diploma, they're going out there, how many of them are ready to hit the ground running? And those chief academic officers said 90%. 90% of these students that are graduating here are ready to go and hit the ground running. But when they asked that same question of business leaders, they said, for these people that are graduating and coming into the business world, how many of them are ready to hit the ground running for you in your business? Only 10% of business leaders agreed with that statement. Only 10%. Is it because they didn't have a lot of knowledge, education, things put in their heads? Well, yes, they actually did, but they hadn't had a chance to apply it critically and start learning, okay, here's the theory that I have, but here's what it looks like in reality once it's in practice. So there's a lot of different components to that. I thought that's always a good reminder that so much of what we learn, though, is from hands-on experiential, and that's the thing that we need to remember as we go through this today, talking about measuring the skills, is a lot of the things we gather are not tracked in any sort of formal learning context. Oops, okay. So I'm not a developer. I found this the other day, and I thought this was humorous but relevant to the conversation. If I asked you how most of us evaluate someone's skill level, if you say, okay, you're an engineer 1, engineer 2, engineer 3, well, if you're an engineer 1, you have 0 years of experience, or if you're an engineer 2, you have 2 years of experience, and we start to adjust that based on how long someone's done something. The most common way we estimate someone's skill level on a range is based on how many years they've done it, the length of time. So this post I saw the other day, he says, hey, you got to have 4 years experience to be a developer in this space. His challenge was, though, that he and the team that built this software, built this programming language, it's not even 2 years old yet. So when someone requires that they have 4 year experience, that's an impossibility, right? It's a paradox. It's a reminder that we rely on years of experience as a crutch, as a substitute for evaluating someone's real ability to do something, their real value from a perspective of where they are on the spectrum of skills maturity. Are they good at this? Are they new at this? Have they been doing it for a long time? They've got it down. They're squared away. We assume that someone's length of time there is the best fit. And tell me this doesn't sound very familiar to you. How do we most often choose who moves into a managerial role in our companies? Well, that person's been here for a long time. They don't have anywhere else to go in their salary ladder. Let's move them over to a manager, even though it might be the worst decision you could possibly make, because that person may really like being an individual contributor. They might be really great at their job and terrible at being a manager. But we use that tenure, that length of time, length of service, as a proxy for their skill level, and we assume that they want to make that leap. I'm going to encourage you not to do that as we go through the conversation today. So one of the research studies we did last year, we looked at and we actually asked over 1,000 talent leaders and workers, learners. We asked them how they wanted to gather new skills. We asked them what skills are most important, things like that in this study. But we also asked, are your skills tracked? Are you tracking the skills of your workforce? And how are you doing that if you are? And what we found in that study is the most common way, as you can see here, the most common way employers are measuring the skills of their people through manager observations, letting managers take a look and supervisors looking at people and deciding whether they have that skill or not. Second most common was skills tests or assessments, peer feedback, self-reporting. And then 1 out of every 20, we're not even sure how we're doing this, which probably is actually larger percentage than that. If I had to guess, people just picking one that felt comfortable. So what's interesting here, I'm gonna actually flip over. So this middle column is the same set of data you just saw. That's from the talent leaders, people that actually know what's happening in the business. But the right column here, this is pulled from a study we did, a publication we did about this study. The right column here is actually the workers' perspective of this. If I'm a learner, if I'm an employee, how are they measuring my skills? And you'll see in every single case, except for I'm not sure, in every single case, they're less certain, less sure, less clear about how their companies are measuring their skills. Think about that last bottom right block there. 1 out of every 5 employees says, I don't know if my company knows what my skills are. How does that feel to be one of those employees? To say, I'm not sure if my company knows what my skills are, if they're aware of the things that I care about, if they're aware of my strengths, the best things I can bring to this company. I don't know if they're even aware of those things. Probably not a great place to be. They're probably not thrilled about that experience, about that space they're in. And that's one of the things that drives me here to have these conversations, to talk at the topic we're talking about today, because I feel like we can do a better job of that, even if it's just making it clear to them, right? If the truth is that 95% of companies are actually measuring, well, that's an opportunity for us to make that clear to the people. We want to know what your skills are. We are using these different methods. We're using manager observations. So tell your manager, if you have a new skill, you're taking a night classes and you picked up this new thing that we didn't even know about, share those things up with us so we can make sure we understand that and we can leverage your strengths and those things that you care about, your aspirations. And from a company perspective, we want to use the things, the people that people bring to the table, but if we don't know about them, we can't. So it's not all on us. I don't think we have all responsibility there, but I do think that we need to make sure the culture is supportive of that and encourages people to do it. One of the stats in the study, I haven't thought about it since the study until just now when I was saying that, we asked we analyzed this by generation, by life stage. If you're in the millennial bucket, if you're in the boomer bucket and so on, how much of this is on you? And what we found is the older or more senior the employees got, the more likely they were to say, it's on me to identify my skills and tell my company. But the younger they were, the less experienced they were, the more they expected their manager, their company, someone else to be the ones driving those conversations. So keep that in mind too, depending on the workforce you have, what that makeup looks like, that might shift how you think about that. So I'm going to go through, I'll make the confession that as a researcher, as an analyst, I've got to have a chart, a graph in every single deck. That's just part of it, right? It's like my calling card, my pocket protector. I built this out for you, specifically for this session, because I wanted to walk through this and look at this with you and help you understand. So what you see here on the screen, there's two different axes. One is how quickly you can scale one of those different methods we just looked at on the previous page, and also how accurate they are. And what we know are things like self-reported, we're not very great at reporting and understanding our own strengths. We think we're better than we are, or in some cases, some of the data actually show that, for instance, women might actually be better than the men in some areas, but they judge themselves more critically, and so they rate themselves more poorly. So there's lots of different lenses there. We'll talk about some of those other things that relate to that conversation in a minute. But some of those things make that it's really easy for me to say, for all of you that are here on this webinar today, I need you to take 2 minutes and rate your skills. Tell me your top 3. Where are you on those, from proficient to lousy, rating those skills. All of us could do that really quickly, but they wouldn't be super accurate compared to other methods. Whereas the most accurate thing we can do, the most predictive method that there is for telling someone's skills, is actually using some sort of assessment, some sort of repeatable test, because it doesn't care who you are. It asks everyone the same way. It treats them the same way. It doesn't change the interaction based on the color of a person's skin or their gender or anything like that. It treats them all the same. So it gets a more accurate picture of that. But it's a little bit harder to do those. It's a little bit harder to get people to go through that process, and it can be costly to do tons and tons and tons of those if you don't have a way to get that rolled out to your people quickly. So it's all over the place here. I wanted to kind of get that set in your mind, because we're going to talk about these different ways and how to prioritize them. Because if I told you tomorrow, if your senior leadership came to you and said, we need to understand the skills in our business, and you were one of those people earlier that said, we are like 0%, 10%, we're down here at the bottom end, we don't have any idea what our skills are, and we just need to get up to speed quickly. Well, a quick way to do that, as we see here, would be self-reporting. Let people just raise their hand and say, these are the skills I have. Is it the most accurate? No, but it gives you at least a data point. I'm going to talk about this in some math terms here for a second. We'll turn on our math brain. We'll simplify this, because as we understand this, we'll move on to getting better and more accurate pictures of the skills. So let's say that this here is a score. This is your self-assessment of how good you are, right? This might be my self-assessment. I won't ever tell, but you're looking really good. You think you're knocking out of the park. Your performance is on an uptick. And this second line here is actually the score that your manager gives you on your manager assessment. This is how they see your performance. Not quite as positive, but hey, still upward trend. Things are looking good. If I asked you right now where your performance is, you'd probably say somewhere right there where the intersection is, right? Somewhere between their view and your view is the real truth. Now, what about this? This is a peer review, right? Or an assessment, a 360, something like that. We get a different perspective entirely of your performance, and it's not looking as good. I said, now, where is your performance? Suddenly it's not as clear, right? It could be any one of those areas where the things intersect. Any one of those white/gray dots could be where your performance is, but the truth is it's somewhere right there where the black dot is. It's an approximation of all these ideas, these different lenses we can look through, and that's called vectoring. Being able to use these different pieces of data to get closer and closer approximations of the actual skills or abilities of an individual. So I wanted to give you that one, because I'm going to go into how to start thinking about this and how to use this in some practical ways. Now that you understand that using one, probably not the best idea, using multiple gives you a better picture. So priority lens, as I talked about earlier, maybe your manager, your leadership team comes to you and says, we need to get this understanding up quickly. The quickest priority, the easiest way to do that is to say self-reported. Let's just let people start telling us what their skills are. They can raise their hand and tell us what they're good at. Some of the things that are in there, we'll talk about the bias stuff in just a bit, so I'm going to hold off on really digging into those. But there are some ideas here, and you'll get these slides. There are some ideas here, though, that are recommendations for how to minimize the bias for each of these, so that we we don't end up with an inaccurate picture, or we don't end up punishing a certain individual or group of people because of something that's out of their control. First, self-reported. Second priority will be managers, because that's pretty scalable as well. We can let managers look at their people, look at their teams, and start rating them, maybe validating or verifying those skills the people self-reported. Ben said he's good at X. Manager says, yes, Ben is good at X. We're going to give him that stamp of approval, and that's a data point. And then last, if we have skills tests or things like that for specific skills in the business that really matter, maybe we're a professional services organization, we've got to have really good consulting skills, and so we're doing some assessments on that, or we've got to be really good at selling, so we have to do some assessments on that, whatever it might be around those key skills for the business, and weave those in to create this picture. The difference between this and one of those previous graphs that I showed you, I think this is the last graph I actually have, so fair warning there. The difference between this one and the other one is you'll see that manager observations plus self-reported, putting those pieces of the puzzle together to create a better picture, a more accurate picture, because it brings them closer together. They're together a little more accurate than you would get than just using one or the other. Not as quick, because we're adding in a layer of difficulty, but also more accurate, and that lets us make better decisions based on the data. So take a second. We got the chat functionality there. I want to give you 20 seconds or so. Why do you think manager observations are not the most accurate? You saw on the chart there, we didn't rate them highly accurate as a method, but I'd love to hear from you. What do you think might be a reason those manager observations are not the most accurate option there? And actually, Tony, I can't see the chats. There we go. Okay. Subjective, things are biased. Yes. Okay. I gave you a couple clues leading up to this. I want to make sure you picked up on those. So good. Managers, their observations are very subjective. They're through their own lens, and they can also be biased. And I'm going to show you some of the things that weigh into these decisions, some of the pieces of these conversations that might actually be a challenge there. So I grabbed a list of some of the ones that I have talked to companies about in this last year that they are working on, they are struggling with, they are dealing with. These are just some of the ones that I have personally heard from companies talking about in the last year. Now, keep this in mind. Let's think about how these relate to skills. What stereotypes? Well, in one study of performance management data, women were given general praise for their work. Martha, great job on that work, well done. But men were given instructions on how to improve their performance in that study. Joe, good job on that. Next time you should X to make that better. Women were more likely to get this general just pat on the back, and men got that support that said, not only good job, but here's how you can be better next time. And over time, that compounds and makes it more challenging in that example for women to be able to bring their best self, to be able to bring their best skills to the workplace. What about this idea of idiosyncratic rater bias? So that means we can have a lot of variability in the decisions we make. So if I'm rating you and we have another person rating you, those two ratings may be wildly different because we see the world differently or we perceive things differently. How about this? There's even difference. There can be a bias in how I rate the same person at different times of the day or the week. Dan Pink's book, When, talks about how this happens in some kind of silly ways, but also in some very serious ways. Like when judges are handing out a verdict, they're more likely to be very harsh to someone in the afternoon than they are in the morning time. So the decisions we make, even within an individual person's spectrum, can vary very widely there as well. And then one last one to talk about the skills piece of it. What about contrast bias? Well, that's when we compare someone to other people instead of comparing that person to that person. Saying Mary was a 7 this year when she started the year, and she, instead of comparing Mary's score to the beginning of the year, we say, yeah, but Joe is better than Mary, and so Mary just hasn't been doing that good. Mary might be actually better than she was at the beginning of the year, but we might be comparing her to other people, contrasting her with other people instead of contrasting her with her own actual performance. I might say that you're worse at a skill than you really are because someone else had that skill and is better than you. And it's not because you're bad, but you're wrong, you're worse, but just because I'm comparing the wrong kinds of things. What I want you to take away from this, though, is that not that manager observations are bad. There are good things with that, and we talked about the value of them in the process, but if that's all that you're relying on, we're missing out. We're missing out on some real value. And these are the human traits that factor in, that make that kind of messy. And if you want to feel a little bit, if you feel like this list here is a little overwhelming, hold your breath. I hope you're sitting down, hold your chair. I'm going to show you this. This is actually the Cognitive Bias Codex. It lists 188 different human biases that we know about. There may be others we don't even know about yet, but these are the ones that behavioral scientists have uncovered. There's nearly 200 of them. If these different biases affect our decisions about what to eat, who to talk to on a daily basis, where we go for coffee, if they affect those kinds of minor decisions, do you think they enter into how managers perceive the skills that people have? Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's not a bad thing. Manager observations are not, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but do not rely on them as the sole way of doing this, or you're missing out on some opportunities, and you may be harming certain people in the business that haven't done anything to deserve that. One of my very good friends, when I worked for the company I mentioned earlier, the government contractor, the people that I had a lot of respect for in the business were, we call them program managers. They're project managers essentially, but they would manage one of these big contracts, multiple years, dozens of employees, major budgets, sometimes not just people, but also hardware. We actually, fun fact, we built a lot of simulator hardware for people who were learning to fly Black Hawk helicopters. So people who flew them, people who maintained or repaired them. One of my good friends was a program manager for those projects. And one of the things that he reported on in every one of our company meetings, I'd bring turnover stats and other engagement data, things that I had to the table from an employee perspective. And he would bring things like this chart you see on the screen, which is a risk management tool. And he would have his red, yellow, green to talk about this thing over here is a risk that I'm watching. Right now, it's very low likelihood. It's not going to have much of an impact. So probably not a big deal, but I just want it to be on your radar. All the way up to this thing, if it goes wrong, it's gonna impact the project. We're gonna slip budget, we're gonna slip schedule, customer's gonna be upset, it's gonna cost us a renewal on the contract. Like, this is a really big red flag. We need to be aware of this before it hits us between the eyes. And they use this tool to help visualize risk and see it in a way, because the truth is humans are really, really bad at understanding risk, at perceiving risk, at deciding how much risk there is. We just don't do a really good job at that. And we often use the wet finger in the air as our estimation of something as an opportunity or a challenge, instead of using actual data. And I said earlier, I want us to be more evidence-based. I firmly believe that's our key to really having great impact on a business level, not just an HR level, not just a talent level or a learning, but from a business impact standpoint, the data are going to help us do that. Okay, so let's transition a little bit. I'm gonna tell you some stories, some examples. We're gonna jump into these things, and I'm gonna tell you these are real companies. I do not have permission to share the names of them, so I'm gonna stay out of that, but they're industry specific. So I'll give you some ideas there about what they are, where they are, so you can understand a little more about the story behind it. And they will help you hopefully navigate what feels like the Rubik's Cube you got here on the screen. I've never beat one of those things. I've tried a couple times. It feels unsolvable. And sometimes this whole question about how to get better measurement of the skills and analysis of the skills in the business seems like one of those puzzles, seems unsolvable. But I want to tell you, some of these different companies that I'm talking about here have solved different pieces of it. And so I want you to get some clarity there, understand. I have not given you stories of companies who have solved it 100%, because I've yet to meet one of those. If you're one of those, please give me a call. I'd love to talk to you. But these companies have solved a part of this skill puzzle, and I want to share them with you because they'll give you some things you can actually reach for, some things you can aspire to, and maybe use some new ideas as well. One of the things I asked you earlier was, what is the most prevalent way we evaluate someone for succession? And the way we do that is tenure, right? We say, how long have you been here? Can we decide if you're ready to move up to the next role, next level, next leadership position, things like that? I ran across a story of this retail organization, and they were using one of these key leadership behaviors that if you could snap your fingers right now and every leader in your business was really good at that skill, you would be thrilled, because it leads to better engagement for employees, it leads to better outcomes, leads them to be excited about coming to work. If you could snap your fingers and make that skill happen, this company actually started using that as a leadership indicator for who was ready for succession to grow into a role. And that skill was actually someone's ability and willingness to give feedback to others. So this company I'm talking about here, they are one of the retail pharmacy organizations, serve a lot of customers, and one of the things they found was they had all these people who had been throughout the business who were starting to give feedback to others in the organization, reviewing them, giving them a kudos, peer feedback, those kinds of things. And we know as talent leaders that one of the hardest things to get most managers to do is to give that feedback. So what they started doing is using that person's willingness. If I'm in an individual contributor role, I'm a clerk, I'm a pharmacist, I'm a whatever individual contributor I am in the business, if I am giving people feedback on a regular basis around me, even though I don't have to, no one's making me do that. They're not paying me to do that. I'm just doing it of my own free will because I'm looking for ways to add value and create better engagement with people around me. They started using that as an indicator for who might be willing, or not just willing, but able to grow into a leadership role and actually be predisposed to doing those things that we have to sometimes fight and twist their arm to get leaders to actually do those activities. So I love that story. That's an example of measuring one of the core critical leadership skills and using that for a succession perspective. Okay. So professional services, let's take a look at this one. There's one of the largest companies in the world, let's say that, professional services organization. They were really struggling to figure out who their SMEs, their subject matter experts, were inside the business. They have hundreds of thousands of people. Like, which people are good at X or Y or Z? Which ones are the best? Because lots of people have said they're the best, but we're looking for something to validate that and verify that so that we actually know before we add them to a team on a major customer account, we know that they're actually good at that stuff. So what they started doing is they started looking at, they have this internal forum inside the company, kind of a social platform where people can ask questions. If you envision like a Quora type thing, if you visited Quora, asked a question or answered a question there, it's basically this open site where anyone can ask a question on anything that you want. And so they have that type of open question format inside the business. So if I'm working on, I don't know, building a new branding strategy for our talent acquisition team, I could go out there and say, hey, who is really sharp on the branding side? Answer these questions about branding so I know you are, and allows that person, the audience there, to respond to those. The person that gets the highest rated response in that becomes an expert in that company's eyes for those skills. And they use this over time to start validating and creating this pool of people. So when I need someone for branding, the people that answered the best answers, the best voted answers for all those types of questions get pushed to the top. So we can have this short list of high quality people without just doing a search for that skill and looking for them. So that was exciting, not just for that perspective, but when you think about it, their best performing subject matter experts in those areas are becoming performance coaches, basically, because they're sharing that expertise with everybody else in the business too. So it creates a couple layers of value in that sort of approach. One of my good friends works in learning for a large healthcare organization, and he told me this story about how the company a few years ago was actually going to go down this path, embarking on a multi-million-dollar training effort for their entire sales team, because they had realized that we're struggling with sales in some areas. Sales are starting to slip. Maybe people aren't ready. They're not speed on the new products. Maybe they don't know our value proposition. Maybe they're not aware of the customers and aware of the competition in the market. They started trying to second guess and figure out what that gap was. And they're like, we'll just put this big sales training and effectiveness thing together and solve that. And then someone said, hey, wait a minute, let me go and look at our data for a second. And they went and looked at the handful of sales professionals who were at the very top, and they compared them with the rest of them And they started doing some interviews and focus groups, and they found that the people who were at the very top had a handful of behaviors they exhibited, behaviors, skills. They had a handful of competencies that set them apart. So instead of, they realized this kind of last minute, they called off that overall big picture sales training and they changed the direction to say, let's instead focus on these specific behaviors. The best performing ones on our sales team have these behaviors. Let's go spend our time developing those in everybody else. And what they found was it solved their problem. The sales issue went away. They eliminated that slump, but they also got better clarity around the specific competencies for performance. So next time they're hiring someone, you better believe they were looking at those 3 or 4 behaviors that actually led to results instead of just saying, have you sold before? Okay, you're in. They're actually looking at the specific behaviors those people exhibited and making sure and comparing them against what they know as a high performing employee is modeled on inside the business. Those actual skills, in case you're curious, for those, a handful of them were things like asking questions. Instead of showing up acting like you know the answers, ask questions, be curious. One of the other things they did was taking a more consultative approach and saying, and trying to get really good understanding and awareness of the problem so they could help them think through a solution and kind of co-create that together. Instead of saying, well, that's your problem and I'm over here if you want the solution, it's like, hey, how can we come together and think about how to solve this? So they kind of took that more consultative approach and really focused on building the relationships and spending time with people versus I'll call you and I'll try to sell you and then I'm hanging up and I'm not calling you again until I try to sell you again. So a couple of those behaviors that they saw really led to better results there. And last but not least, our story that didn't end so well. So I had a conversation with this company about a year ago, and they were really struggling with building out some digital teams inside the business. They were trying to make sure their company was ready for change. And as we know this year, change is inevitable. Sometimes it's more fast-paced than other years. They're trying to get the company ready for change and embed some digital skills in the business. So they started with using those manager observations to identify the skills, and they pretty quickly ran out of people. They actually understood out of over 40,000 employees in the world they only understood the skills for about 10% of those people. So they had more than 30,000 employees. Beyond their job title, they didn't know what they could do, what they wanted to do, what their aspirations were, what their strengths might be. So they couldn't tap into those people, even though they were right there. And in many cases, they're willing to be tapped on the shoulder and say, hey, we would love to use what you have, the strengths you have, to make the business better and serve our customers. Most people would love to be tapped on the shoulder and asked that question, but they couldn't do it because they didn't know which people had the skills they needed. So I'm not identifying them to beat them up or anything else, but I'm just showing you that this does happen. Even in very large organizations, this kind of thing does happen, and there's a real cost to that. Think about, they were not able to meet customer demand. They were not able to adapt the business in a quick way because they didn't have the right people in the right places at the right time. And it's because ultimately, when you go all the way into the analysis of the problem, they didn't have the clarity of the skills to know where to tap into those people and where to use them. So I meant to tell you this a little bit ago, and I missed my cue on it, but I'll give you 20, 30 seconds here. If I was going to ask you to caption your own case study here, you can be serious, you can be funny. Think about where you are, right? Hey, we're on our way. We're just getting started down this path. Our approach is a train wreck. Take a second, drop a comment in about where you see your approach currently. I'm just kind of curious where you might be on that spectrum of we're trying, we're doing our best, we've been unsuccessful so far, but we have hope. We're positive about this. I was kind of curious. I wanted you to understand that, think through that a little bit about where you are, because that's going to help you as you think about where you can go from here. Someone said a work in progress. Yes, absolutely. I would think a lot of people would agree with that. Someone said eating your own dog food. I hate that phrase. Oh, goodness. I much prefer drinking your own champagne or something like drinking the Kool-Aid. I do not love the eating our own dog food phrase there. That gets me. Okay, so some good answers here. Trying to get better, trying to get more mature. In general, it sounds like, well, good, because guess what? Now we're queued up for our next steps, our action items. Some ideas to get you a little more mature in that area, to help you lead your team, lead your business, to go in that right direction. So let's dig into these explore them, look at what it takes to do that. So you remember this from earlier. The first thing we've got to do is start gathering some of that data. You need to collect it, start verifying it. Think about the tools that you're using right now. If the tools don't support this, it's going to be really difficult. It's going to be really difficult for you. There's actually a concept called a Dunbar number that says a human can only have so many connections with other humans before they start to lose the details. And there's a number on that based on some research they found. There's a limit to how many connections we can have with other people. Take that concept and parallel it over to this. We can only understand the skills of a certain number of people around us. And once we get to that second layer of people, that second level of people beyond that initial circle, we get much less clear, and it gets more fuzzy the farther out we go from that initial circle around us. So the farther out we go, we lose that clarity. You need to be able to use the tools to store this, but also to be able to retrieve it and gather that data out. Think about where you're going to use the data. I guess you could snap your own fingers. If you could snap your fingers right now and you could have the skill data of your entire workforce at your fingertips, if you could just snap your fingers and make that happen, do you know what you would do with it? Is it like the dog chasing a car? Once he catches it, he doesn't know what to do with it next? Or do you have a plan for what you do with that? Do you have some use cases, some ideas on how you could actually apply that in the business? Do you have an initiative right now that's happening that you could actually use that skill data to solve that problem, to answer the question, to act more quickly, to act more confidently, and with better precision? Do you have the data? If you had it, what would you use those things for? We need to understand this part of it. This isn't just a wishful thinking, but understanding that will help you figure out which of those specific skills you need, which of the skills data you need, how to use them, where you're going to adapt that for. Because just saying we need to get better overall, that's not very helpful. And I'm not a fan of saying, well, you just got to do that. We got to figure out how we're going to use it in some of these applications in our own space, in our own wheelhouse from an HR or talent perspective, so we can do this. One thing I'll encourage you on too is I've seen a lot of stories in the last couple of years around we've got a skills gap. We've got a skills gap in our business. And that sometimes that does happen. But it's not just about identifying that gap or that weakness. There's risk there. We talked about that being a theme today in the conversation, but it's also about identifying and leveraging the strengths of your people. We did a study a few years ago on the performance management practices of high performing companies with better business results and revenue than their peers. And we found that companies that have better revenue and better employee engagement and better retention, one of the things they do in their top 5 is they actually focus on the strengths of their people instead of focusing on shoring up their weaknesses and focusing on the skills gaps. So we need to understand the gaps, but not just focus on that because we're missing some of those. How about applications outside of talent management? How would the other leaders in your business react if you could tell them the skill data that exists to support the things they're trying to do, the problems they have, the issues they're trying to solve? Think about that sales example I gave earlier. Right? That sales is a real problem for the business, not just for the sales team, but for the organization, because that's how the lifeblood of the company. How could we solve their kind of problems? So think about that. One of these tools that I've used over the years when we're talking about HR strategy is I have a pair of dice in my travel bag that goes everywhere with me. And on one of the dice, it has a bunch of things, a bunch of different HR levers we can pull. Learning, training, onboarding, hiring, those kinds of things that we can pull levers on the HR side. The other one has a bunch of business problems on it. Things like you see here. We have a quality issue, sales issue, the efficiency of the business is not where it needs to be, customer service problems. And one of the things I get people to do is roll those 2 dice and think about a way to solve that problem, the business problem, with the thing that comes up. So if it's a quality issue and onboarding comes up, well, let's spend time in the onboarding process talking about quality, emphasizing it, showing what it looks like, right? That's pretty simplistic, but the bigger picture here is business problems are the ones we need to be solving. Right? I gave you some examples, like these are HR problems, but these should enable the business to solve the problems that it's facing, whether it's on the sales side, it's customer service, it's quality, any of those kinds of things. We want to solve the problems that our leaders have, because those are the things that are going to lead us to getting better outcomes for the business. One of the other ones here, I said career pathing, succession planning would also fall in here. Yeah, someone asked about that. Absolutely. So there's a couple different things, obviously, we can do here that enable the business applications, business problems to solve. We did a study a couple of years ago in talent acquisition around measurement practices and how we measure as a function to get better at that. And one of the big lessons that we learned is it's not about going from 0 to 100% overnight, because that doesn't happen. Again, even companies with virtually unlimited budgets can't do that quickly. You can't turn on a dime in that way. So a couple of different steps here to think about that you can do. This is not a destination. It's not a you just do this and you're done. But I also, you'll notice in the case studies I gave you today, I didn't talk about any companies that are perfect here, because there's not one that's perfect in every single way. So a couple of different ideas here about how to get progressively better at the skills profiling, understanding the people, the skills in your business. How about just one thing, one step you can take? We'll identify the key roles, the ones that are linked to the revenue in the business, and we're going to measure the skills that matter to that. Think about that case study I gave you earlier in healthcare, where they measure the skills of the sales team and figured out which one of those for the key roles mattered. Maybe we say we're going to go an inch deep, but a mile wide across the organization. We'll measure one skill that matters to the business. Maybe our business is really focused on digital transformation, and so we're going to look at trying to measure digital skills and things related to that. So we're going to emphasize digital skills for every person and try to measure how those look for every person in the business. Maybe we're going to go for a team level, or even, again, across the organization. We can get really complex, really in-depth there, and we can spend a lot of time talking about the different layers and how to do that. But the things I want you to remember, let's measure something. And once you start measuring something, you can measure something else. When you start measuring something else, you can start measuring it for more people, more audiences, and reporting on it more regularly. But it just becomes this habit, this process that you start repeating over and over again, and it becomes a part of the value that you bring. That question I asked a little bit ago. How would the leaders in your business respond if you showed up to the next meeting and said, hey, we have some data on these skills that we found are linked to revenue, and look, we actually have a gap here in this area of the business. We want to bring that to you to talk about how we can solve for that. That leads to better conversations, not just in HR terms, but in terms of things the business cares about. So my last plea, my last call, my last idea here before we wrap it up. The cost of not doing this is really hard to quantify. It's like saying, how many times did I not have a car wreck? Or how many times did we not get sued as a business? It's hard to figure out what didn't happen. That's because there's an unseen cost. There's an organization called Humanize that does analysis of remote teams. They've been doing this for a couple of years. Obviously, this has been a good year for them, but they found that when teams go remote, we always assume that those teams are going to lose that collaboration, that connection with each other. But what they found was when teams go remote, they actually overcompensate by adding in more communications, more calls, more Zoom meetings, things like that. But they miss out on those side conversations, the casual innovation where, Dominique walks by and says, hey, I've got a question for you, Joe. I've had this idea. Can we whiteboard this and think about it? And they come up with a new product that is a multi-million-dollar idea. Right? Those kind of things happen in the office, but they're much harder to orchestrate outside. And they found that that's the kind of thing that goes missing when you go virtual. You miss that sort of thing. And it's not a cost that you see immediately. Today, you don't realize, oh, that's, there's $1 million idea that we didn't have, but over time, that's progressively costing you something. This idea here, this understanding of the skills, not having that ironed out, not figuring that out, there is a cost to it. It might be hidden. It might not be immediately obvious. Research shows that poor data quality costs companies millions of dollars a year. Just poor data quality. We think about that like, yeah, customer data, but what about people data? What about the people data in the business? I would argue that that's an essential part. Just like we should have good data on our customers to serve them, we should have good data on our people, not just to serve them, but to leverage what they want to offer, what they bring to the table, the things that they are best at. Okay. I have talked for 55 minutes straight here. Thank thank you for joining me for the discussion so far. If you have a question, you have something that you're curious about, you want to know more about, I would love to entertain one of those questions. I'm on the screen here. I have research, I have links to the work that Talent Guard's doing there. Some of the examples that I gave you, some of the tools that I mentioned, some of the capabilities, that's what they do. They solve these kind of problems. And so I've really enjoyed talking with talking through these ideas with them as a company, because this is what they do, this is how they serve their customers. If you're curious with the research, you want to see some of those studies, anything else, you can ping me, ping the team here at Lighthouse, and we're happy to chat with you a little bit. Let's see.
This has been mentioned. Please feel free to use the chat box to ask your questions. We'll take a few minutes here to answer them.
All right. I saw you just pop one over to me, Tony. Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, they're coming in. So if you can't see the questions, I'm just copying and pasting.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the one I see here is, what about, can we use manager observations without biasing our results? Yes, but I should have been a lawyer, an attorney with that response. Yes, you can use them. But if you remember that vectoring example I gave you, we should not use those as the sole method for understanding the skills of our people, because they're not unbiased. So there's nothing wrong with having managers as part of this, because they're critical for helping you to actually tap into those strengths that people have, understanding them and leveraging those. But they need to be part of this bigger picture. How else can we verify or validate that? Is it self-reported plus a manager? Is it also using an assessment or a 360, something else in there to help us get really clear on that? Maybe we're looking at the learning content that person is doing, or in that professional services case study I gave you, we're using how that person is acting within the company in terms of answering questions and interacting with other people as a metric for what their skills are. So look for some other way to validate that. So it's not just using the manager piece of that. Right. Someone said, what is a good starting point? If you are at 0, or you're early on in your maturity here and you want to get better, start with measuring one thing. It could be, again, I gave you a couple of examples a minute ago. It could be one skill for the entire organization, because the leadership team has said this skill is critical for the success of our business going forward, and we need to measure this and make sure we're focusing on this. In today's world, maybe we're going to focus on inclusion and make sure every single person in our business really gets that we have to be focused on inclusion. That's not one person's job that we could just shift that off, but everyone needs to own a piece of that as well. It could be something more like the case study I gave you in healthcare, where we have a group of people that are critical in the business. We've got to measure a few skills that relate to how the business operates and really get specific on those, measure those, report on those. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time talking today about reporting, but when we're measuring these things, if we're going to help the business solve its problems, we've got to report back on that so they know how to use that skills data we're gathering, how to sort through that, how to leverage that, how to make that actionable and practical for them. Because we are seen as the keepers of the talent. We are seen as the experts in talent in the business. And I would love for us to be as focused and as specific on the data around people and skills as the finance and accounting team is with the spreadsheets and property records and balance sheets and things like that. They know those things. We should know skills just that well, I would say.
It's an excellent answer. Just so we're cognizant of time, I'm just going to wrap it up right now. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Ben, for your insightful presentation. This webinar was recorded and will be sent to everyone via email once it is made available on talentguard.com. If anybody would like to learn more about how they can access verified skills data, remove bias, and apply what was discussed today inside their organization, please reach out to us at sales@talentguard.com or request a software demo on talentguard.com of the process you would like to apply this to. Again, thank you, Ben, and thank you, everybody. Hope you all have a great day.